They waved from the deck of a luxury cruise ship, smiling for photos, champagne glasses raised in the sun. I waved back from a dusty roadside, holding a duffel bag, watching the bus doors close behind me. They said it was a weight loss camp, a reset, a fresh start. I was 16 and I believed them because believing your parents is sometimes the only thing you have left. The bus drove for hours. No music, no announcements, just the sound of tires eating distance. When someone asked when we'd arrive, the driver didn't answer. When I asked if my parents could be called, the phone was taken from my hands like it had never been mine. By the time we stopped, the sun was already low. There was no sign, no cabins, no counselors wearing name tags, just land, fences, and men who didn't bother pretending this was a place meant for kids. One of them checked a clipboard, looked at me and said, "You're paid for." That was the moment I understood something had gone wrong, but not how wrong. The gates closed behind us with a sound I still hear in my sleep. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. No one hit us. No one screamed. That would have been easier to explain later. Instead, we were given rules, work schedules, silence, a new understanding of what time feels like when no one is counting your days for you. I later learned the word for it, labor farm. Not rehabilitation, not education, ownership. My parents had signed papers, real ones, legal ones. They received $50,000. For me. At first, I waited for rescue. Every morning felt like it might be the one where a car pulled up, where someone shouted my name, where a mistake was discovered. But days turned into weeks, weeks into seasons, and hope is loud when it dies. It makes a mess on the way out. So I learned to be quiet. Quiet enough to listen. Quiet enough to watch. Quiet enough to understand how power works when it thinks no one is paying attention. Men argued over contracts near the fence. I memorized words I didn't know yet. Interest, transfer, default, collateral. I learned how numbers scare people more than anger ever could. I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting to be saved. I started thinking like someone who would leave, but on my own terms. 5 years passed. I aged. The farm didn't. One winter, ownership changed. Papers were signed too fast. Someone forgot to check a box. Someone assumed I couldn't read. They were wrong. Freedom didn't come with apologies. It came with a bus ticket and a name I hadn't heard spoken kindly in years. I didn't go home. I didn't confront anyone. I worked. I worked nights. I cleaned offices where people left their confidence on desks and their secrets in trash cans. I learned credit systems. I learned patience. I learned how to make myself invisible in rooms where money moved. And then I found it. My parents' house. The one from the Christmas cards. The one with the matching sweaters and perfect lighting. It was bleeding money. Late payments. Refinance debt. Loans stacked on loans like lies holding hands. They didn't own that house anymore. They were renting it from time. So I did what they never expected. I bought the debt. Not the house. The debt. Christmas came quietly that year. Snow. Lights. Familiar streets I hadn't walked in half a decade. I stood outside the door listening to laughter that didn't include my name. I knocked. My mother screamed. My father went pale. My brother whispered, "That's not possible." They thought I was a ghost. I stepped inside. No shouting. No drama. I didn't raise my voice once. I took off my coat, sat down like I belonged there because legally I did. I handed them an envelope. Inside was a statement. Clear. Final. Official. I said one sentence. I didn't just escape. I now own the debt on this house. Silence does strange things to people who are used to control. My father tried to talk. My mother cried. My brother couldn't look at me. I stood up. "You have 30 days, I said calmly. Pack your bags. I didn't stay to watch them break. I didn't need to. I walked out into the cold, lighter than I'd ever felt. knowing something they never would. They sent me away to erase me. Instead, they taught me exactly how to take everything back, quietly. The snow kept falling after I left, soft enough to erase footprints before anyone could follow them. I walked 3 blocks before I felt my hands shaking, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. Relief doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in when your body finally realizes it no longer needs to stay ready for impact. I didn't look back at the house. I already knew what it looked like inside. Panic would be unfolding in stages. First denial, then bargaining, then anger. They would blame paperwork, banks, timing, anyone but themselves. Accountability is a language they were never taught. I checked into a modest hotel on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. Clean sheets. A door that locked from the inside. That night, I slept without dreaming for the first time in years. No fences. No schedules. No one calling my number instead of my name. The next morning, my phone started ringing. I didn't answer. Messages piled up instead. Long ones. Short ones. Apologies that sounded suspiciously like negotiations. My father's voice cracked in a voicemail he clearly rehearsed. My mother sent paragraphs that never once used the word sorry. My brother didn't message at all. Silence was his way of surviving discomfort. I let the phone sit. People think revenge is about watching someone suffer. It isn't. It's about no longer organizing your life around their reactions. I had already taken what mattered most, control. Everything else was just noise. Over the next few weeks, the process moved forward exactly as contracts said it would. Notices were sent. Deadlines established. The house became quiet in a different way. Not festive quiet. Empty quiet. The kind that echoes when there's nothing left to perform for. I visited once briefly during the inspection. The walls were thinner than I remembered. The room smaller. It was strange to see the place stripped of decorations and denial. Without the photos and furniture, it was just a structure, one that had held a story it never deserved credit for. The inspector asked if I wanted to renovate or sell. I thought about it. Then I said, sell. Some places aren't meant to be reclaimed. They're meant to be released. When the sale closed, I didn't celebrate. I transferred funds quietly, settled accounts, and closed the file. That chapter didn't need a ceremony. Closure doesn't require witnesses. What surprised me most was how ordinary life felt afterward. I went to work. I cooked meals. I started jogging in the mornings just because I could choose when to stop. I learned what boredom felt like and realized it wasn't emptiness. It was peace without adrenaline. One afternoon, weeks later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed. Still careful. Still controlled. She wrote about memories. About mistakes. About family. She asked if we could talk. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in a drawer. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Some conversations are designed to pull you back into roles you've outgrown. I didn't owe them healing. I owed myself continuity. Sometimes people ask how I did it. How I survived 5 years where no one came looking. How I walked back into a room that erased me and spoke without shaking. The answer is simple and uncomfortable. I didn't wait to be rescued. I prepared to return on my own terms. And when I did, I didn't ask for recognition. I presented proof. Years later, I heard my parents moved into a smaller place. Rentals. Temporary addresses. My brother changed cities. Changed jobs. Changed stories. He stopped telling people his childhood was perfect. I never corrected him. Truth has a way of finding people when they're finally quiet enough to hear it. As for me, I kept going. I built a life that didn't require permission. One that didn't depend on forgiveness to function. One where my past didn't disappear, but it also didn't lead. Every December now, when lights go up and people talk about family traditions, I take a walk in the cold and remind myself of something important. They sent me away thinking distance would erase me. Instead, it taught me exactly how to come back. Without asking for a seat at the table, time passed in a way that didn't feel like punishment anymore. It moved normally, gently, like it does for people who aren't counting days just to survive them. I stopped measuring weeks by progress and started noticing smaller things. How sunlight shifts across a room, how silence can feel full instead of threatening, how hunger can mean appetite instead of scarcity. I changed my number, not because I was afraid of hearing from them, but because I no longer wanted my nervous system reacting to names that no longer had authority over me. You don't realize how much space someone occupies in your mind until they're gone and nothing collapses. I rented a small apartment near the edge of the city. No view, no history, just clean walls and a window that opened when I wanted air. The first night there, I sat on the floor eating takeout straight from the container, and it felt strangely ceremonial. No rules, no supervision, no one timing how long I rested. Freedom isn't loud at first. It whispers. It asks questions you've never been allowed to answer honestly. What do you want to do today? When do you want to sleep? Who do you want to be when no one is watching? I didn't rush to respond. I let myself be slow. Work continued, steady and unremarkable. That was the point. I chose stability over spectacle, power over performance. Every paycheck reminded me that I was no longer property. Every signature carried weight because it was mine. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for consequences that never came. For a knock on the door. For someone to tell me it was all a misunderstanding. Trauma has a way of convincing you that peace is temporary. But the knock never came. Instead, one afternoon, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. Short, formal, carefully written. My brother. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't apologize. He asked how I learned what I knew. How I managed to do what I did. How I stayed calm. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. Some lessons are expensive because they require loss. And I wasn't interested in giving him a discount. Weeks later, I saw my parents by accident. A grocery store. Middle aisle. Canned food section. They looked smaller. Not older, just diminished, like people who had spent years leaning on something that suddenly disappeared. My mother recognized me first. Her face moved through shock, hope, fear, all in seconds. My father stood still, like movement might break whatever fragile dignity he had left. No one spoke. I nodded once. Polite. Distant. Then I walked past them and picked up what I came for. That moment mattered more than the night I handed them the bill. Because power isn't proven in confrontation. It's proven in indifference. And for the first time, their presence didn't rearrange my breathing. Later that evening, I realized something quietly significant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished carrying explanations. Finished rehearsing arguments. Finished waiting for understanding. People like to imagine survival stories ending with dramatic closure, with tears and confessions and recognition. But real closure is subtle. It happens when your past stops demanding airtime in your present. I began volunteering not because I needed redemption but because I recognized patterns. Kids who flinched at raised voices. Teens who asked permission for things they didn't need permission for. I didn't tell them my story. I didn't need to. Sometimes presence is enough to disrupt a cycle. On the anniversary of the night I came back, I didn't mark it publicly. I took the day off, went for a long walk, and sat by the river watching the water move forward without hesitation. No memory. No resentment. Just momentum. People sometimes ask if I ever think about what they lost. I do. But more often I think about what I gained, not the money, not the house, not the leverage. Clarity. Clarity that love without accountability is performance. Clarity that silence can be strategy. Clarity that survival doesn't require permission. They thought they were sending me away. What they really did was remove themselves from the future I was building. And that future didn't need revenge to exist. It only needed space. The strange thing about rebuilding your life is that no one announces when you've crossed the point of no return. There's no ceremony for becoming untouchable. It happens quietly, in moments so ordinary you almost miss them. Like the day I realized I no longer checked exits when I entered a room, or the first time someone raised their voice near me, and my body didn't brace for impact, or the morning I woke up late and laughed instead of panicking. Those moments stacked on each other, slowly rewriting who I was allowed to be. I started investing, not aggressively, not recklessly. I'd learned what impatience costs. I chose long games, ones that didn't require applause. I read contracts the way some people read novels, looking for what wasn't said, for pauses disguised as promises. Money stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like insulation. At work, people began to notice. Not my past, my steadiness. The way I didn't rush decisions. The way I listened longer than expected. I was offered a promotion I didn't ask for. Then another opportunity. I accepted neither immediately. Power, I'd learned, grows best when you don't grab at it. I moved again, this time by choice. A quieter neighborhood. Trees. A balcony that caught the evening light just right. I furnished slowly, deliberately. Nothing matched perfectly, but everything belonged to me. Every object had a reason to be there. One night, while unpacking a box I'd carried for years without opening, I found something small at the bottom. A photograph. Me at 16. Taken weeks before the bus ride. I was smiling, unaware, still believing safety was permanent. I didn't cry. I studied the photo like evidence. Not of innocence, but of resilience I hadn't known how to name yet. I placed it back in the box and sealed it. Not to hide it, to archive it. Around that time, a mutual acquaintance reached out. Someone who knew my family before everything fractured. They asked carefully worded questions. How I was doing. If I'd spoken to them. If there was any chance of reconciliation. I answered honestly but briefly. I'm well, I said. No, I said. And no. Boundaries don't need justification. They need consistency. Months passed. The world kept turning. News cycles changed. Stories replaced other stories. And I understood something that would have terrified my younger self. The world does not stop for your pain. And that's not cruelty, it's opportunity. It means you're allowed to move on without waiting for closure to be approved. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I received a legal notice. My parents had attempted to contest the debt transfer months earlier. It had failed quietly. No hearing. No drama. Just a rejection stamped with finality. They were learning what it felt like to be unheard. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just confirmation. That night, I cooked dinner for myself and ate slowly, enjoying the fact that no one rushed me. No one counted portions. No one monitored my behavior like it was a transaction. Later, standing at the window watching city lights blink on one by one, I realized something subtle but profound. I was no longer explaining my existence to myself or anyone else. I wasn't the kid who was sent away. I wasn't the problem that needed fixing. I wasn't the shadow they tried to forget. I was someone who survived without becoming cruel, who returned without becoming loud, who won without announcing it. People often misunderstand stories like mine. They look for villains and heroes, for dramatic justice, for endings that feel cinematic. But real power doesn't feel cinematic. Feels stable. Feels quiet. It feels like waking up and knowing the worst is already behind you. And it stayed there because you didn't carry it forward. And somewhere out there, my parents still live with the echo of a decision they thought would disappear. I live with something better. A future that doesn't require forgiveness to function. A life that doesn't ask for permission. A silence that finally belongs to me. There came a point when people stopped asking about my past entirely. Not because they knew it, because they could feel it didn't define me anymore. That shift changes how rooms treat you. Conversations linger longer. People pause before interrupting. Your words don't need urgency to carry weight. I noticed it in meetings, in casual exchanges, even in silence, especially in silence. Silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like authority. I kept my routine simple. Morning walks, black coffee, a notebook I didn't force myself to fill. I stopped trying to be productive with my healing. I let it unfold at its own pace. Some days felt expansive. Others felt blank. Both were acceptable. One evening, while waiting for a train, I caught my reflection in the glass. Not the face I remembered. Not hardened. Not fragile. Just present. I held my own gaze without flinching. That mattered more than any apology I'd never receive. I began mentoring quietly, nothing official. Just conversations. People found me when they needed clarity without judgment. I never shared details unless asked. And even then I kept it light. Trauma doesn't need to be displayed to be valid. Sometimes it's strongest when it's folded neatly and carried forward. A few years slipped by like that. I traveled. Not to escape, just to experience. I learned how different cities breathe. How anonymity can be comforting. How no one knows who you used to be unless you tell them. In one place, I stayed long enough to learn the rhythm of the streets. In another, just long enough to remember that leaving can be painless. Every now and then, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. A smell. A song. A phrase someone used casually. The difference now was what followed. The memory arrived and then it left. No spiral. No rehearsal. No aftermath. I didn't chase closure anymore. Closure had already moved in and rearranged the furniture. Once during a quiet dinner with friends, someone asked a question meant to spark stories. What's the hardest thing you've ever done? The table laughed. People shared safe answers. Careers. Moves. Breakups. When it was my turn, I smiled and said, I learned how to leave without becoming bitter. No one pressed for more. They didn't need to. That answer carried enough weight to end the curiosity without feeding it. Later that night, walking home alone, I realized something that would have felt impossible years ago. I trusted myself. Not in a motivational way. Not as a mantra. In a grounded, unremarkable sense. I trusted my judgment. My instincts. My ability to recognize danger and choose peace instead. That trust was new and it was permanent. I thought briefly of my parents then. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. With distance. Distance is a strange kind of mercy. It allows you to see patterns without being pulled into them. It lets you understand motivations without excusing harm. It lets you forgive internally without reopening doors. They made choices. So did I. Only one of us learned from them. Life didn't reward me with spectacle. It rewarded me with steadiness. With days that didn't need recovery. With nights that didn't replay conversations on a loop. With mornings that started neutral and stayed that way. I didn't become famous. I didn't become rich beyond comfort. I didn't become a symbol. I became free. And freedom, I've learned, doesn't announce itself. It shows up when you stop bracing. When your shoulders drop without instruction. When your future no longer includes explanations you don't owe. I kept going. Not to prove anything. Not to outrun anything. Just forward. With nothing chasing me anymore. At some point, I stopped thinking of what happened to me as something that needed explaining. It became background, like a scar you forget about until someone else notices it. And even then, you don't feel the need to tell the story. You just acknowledge it exists. Life became almost ordinary. And that was the miracle. I learned the luxury of boredom. The kind that doesn't come from emptiness but from safety. Evenings where nothing urgent demanded my attention. Weekends without plans that felt like gifts instead of wasted time. I could sit with myself without needing distraction. That was new. I used to think strength looked like endurance. Teeth clenched. Jaw tight. Eyes forward no matter what. But real strength, I realized, looks softer. It looks like choosing rest without guilt, like saying no without rehearsing, like trusting silence to speak for you. One afternoon, while reorganizing old files, I found documents related to the house again. Not because I was looking for them, because I'd forgotten they were there. That realization made me pause. There was a time when those papers represented justice, survival, proof. Now they were just paperwork. I closed the folder and put it back where it belonged. Not hidden, just irrelevant. I didn't follow their lives. Not online. Not through others. Curiosity would have been easy, but curiosity can be a form of attachment. And I was done feeding ghosts. Instead, I invested in what was in front of me. Friendships that felt mutual. Conversations that didn't drain me. People who didn't need convincing to treat me well. I became selective, not out of fear but clarity. I no longer confused familiarity with safety. Once someone asked me why I never talk about my family. I answered honestly. They taught me what I don't want to repeat. That was all. The truth doesn't need embellishment when you've already processed it. Years pass like that. Not dramatically. Not painfully. Just steadily. And then something unexpected happened. I felt gratitude. Not for what they did, but for what I learned because of it. I learned how systems work. How power hides behind politeness. How neglect can be dressed up as concern. Those lessons sharpened my instincts in ways comfort never could. But they didn't harden me. That mattered. I still laughed easily. Still trusted carefully. Still believed people could be good without needing proof first. Trauma doesn't get to define your capacity for hope unless you let it. I didn't let it. One winter evening, sitting by the window as snow softened the city, I realized something quietly final. I no longer imagined running into them. That scenario, once rehearsed endlessly, had vanished from my mind. No speeches. No confrontations. No imagined justice. Just absence. An absence, I learned, can be a resolution. They didn't win. I didn't defeat them. I outgrew them. That's the ending no one prepares you for. The one where nothing explodes, no one begs, and no apologies arrive. Just a life that keeps unfolding without them in it. And that, in the end, was more than enough. There's a phase no one talks about after survival. Not the escape. Not the justice. But the after, when nothing is chasing you, and you're left alone with choices instead of consequences. That's when the real work begins. I didn't rush it. I let my life grow the way strong things do, out of sight below the surface. I learned to recognize peace without questioning it. Learned that joy doesn't need to be earned through suffering. Learned that safety doesn't mean stagnation. Some mornings I woke up and felt neutral. And neutrality felt revolutionary. I stopped measuring my worth against milestones. Stopped explaining why I took certain paths. When people asked where I was from, I answered with where I was going instead. Identity stopped being something I defended. Simply existed. I noticed how differently people treated me now. Not because I demanded respect, but because I expected it. There's a subtle shift that happens when you no longer negotiate your boundaries internally. Others sense it before you speak. I became someone people didn't interrupt. That wasn't accidental. I listened more than I spoke, but when I did speak, it landed. Not because my voice was louder, but because it was settled. No urgency. No need to convince. Time passed again. Quietly. I stopped keeping track. Then one day, during a casual conversation, someone mentioned my parents' names in passing. No drama, no tension, just a reference, a neutral fact. My body didn't react. That's how I knew. I'd crossed the line where memory loses its grip. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel relieved. I felt complete, not healed, as if something had been broken and fixed, but integrated, like every version of me had finally taken their place instead of competing for control. The one who survived, the one who endured, the one who left, the one who built. They stopped arguing. They started cooperating. I began saying yes to things that once scared me, not recklessly, deliberately. New spaces, new responsibilities, new risks that felt aligned, not desperate. Growth felt expansive instead of compensatory. I wasn't proving I was okay anymore. I was okay. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the version of me who boarded that bus years ago. The one who didn't know what would happen next. The one who thought abandonment meant erasure. I wish I could tell them this. You will not disappear. You will not become small. You will not need revenge to matter. You will become someone whose absence is louder than their presence ever was. And somewhere else life kept moving too. Not for them but despite them. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they show up as quiet realizations that it's too late to change the narrative. That part wasn't mine to manage. My responsibility ended with choosing myself. And I kept choosing myself, not as an act of defiance, but as a habit. Days stacked into years, years stacked into something stable. I didn't build a life to spite anyone. I built one that didn't require looking back to move forward. And that story, the one no one claps for, the one without spectacle, there's a strange freedom in realizing that nothing is missing. For a long time, I thought something had been taken from me: childhood, trust, safety, time. I framed my future as a recovery project, as if life were something I needed to rebuild from rubble. But one day, sitting alone with no music, no screen, no distraction, it occurred to me. Nothing was missing. Everything that mattered had survived. It had just been waiting. Waiting for space. Waiting for permission. Waiting for me to stop measuring myself by what others had done. That realization didn't come with tears. It came with a long exhale I didn't know I'd been holding. I began to understand why some people never leave the past, not because it hurts, but because it's familiar. Pain can feel safer than uncertainty if it's the only thing you've known. But I had crossed into unfamiliar territory long ago, and I liked it here. I made decisions faster now. Not impulsively, confidently. I trusted my instincts because they'd been refined under pressure. I could sense misalignment early. I didn't second-guess it anymore. When something felt wrong, I stepped away. No explanations. No guilt. Just clarity. I stopped romanticizing struggle. Stopped believing hardship was a prerequisite for meaning. I chose ease when it appeared and didn't sabotage it out of habit. That was growth. Somewhere along the way, people started coming to me not for sympathy but for perspective. They didn't know why I saw things the way I did. They just knew I saw clearly. And clarity is contagious. I never corrected assumptions. Let people believe whatever made sense to them. My story wasn't a performance. It was a foundation. I kept my life intentionally small in some ways and wide in others. Fewer obligations, deeper commitments, less noise, more intention. I learned that peace isn't passive. It's maintained. You choose it again and again, sometimes in quiet defiance of old instincts. Occasionally, a thought would surface: what if they regret it? The question didn't stay long. Regret is a private process. It doesn't require my participation. I didn't need apologies to validate my experience. I didn't need recognition to confirm my worth. I didn't need confrontation to feel resolved. I had something stronger. Continuity. My life made sense from the inside. That's when I understood the final shift had happened. I was no longer surviving from something. I was living toward something. Toward curiosity. Toward stability. Toward days that didn't need explanation. I didn't reclaim my power in one moment. I reclaimed it in 1,000 quiet choices. Each one small, each one firm, each one mine. And the world adjusted accordingly. Nothing dramatic followed. I stopped announcing changes in my life. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything important was happening quietly. I learned that progress doesn't always need witnesses. Some things grow better in privacy. I let plans form fully before speaking them aloud. I let decisions settle into certainty before acting. I stopped rushing moments to feel real. They were real enough without validation. There were days when I did nothing remarkable at all. I cooked. I cleaned. I walked familiar streets. And in those ordinary hours, something unexpected happened. I felt grounded. Not distracted. Not restless. Grounded. It struck me how much energy I used to spend anticipating reactions, preparing for disappointment, bracing for dismissal. That constant readiness had once felt necessary. Now it felt foreign. I didn't flinch when doors closed. I didn't chase conversations that drifted away. I understood that alignment doesn't require persuasion. What belongs stays. What doesn't leaves without drama. That understanding simplified everything. I became careful with my time. Not protective, just intentional. I no longer over-explained why something mattered to me. If someone didn't see its value, that wasn't my burden to correct. Clarity replaced urgency. One afternoon, while organizing old photos, I noticed something subtle. In earlier pictures, my posture was defensive, shoulders slightly raised, jaw set. In newer ones, there was space. My body had stopped preparing for impact. That realization stayed with me. Healing, I learned, shows up physically before you notice it emotionally. I started trusting ease, letting things be uncomplicated when they were. I didn't assume calm meant something bad was coming next. I allowed good days to just be good days. That was a skill I had to practice. Occasionally, someone would ask how I managed to stay so composed. I'd smile and say, I don't argue with reality anymore. That answer confused people, but it was the truest one I had. Reality doesn't need approval. It only needs acknowledgement. Once I stopped fighting what had happened and started building what was possible, everything shifted. I didn't forget the past. I just stopped carrying it everywhere. It stayed where it belonged, behind me, integrated, no longer directing traffic. My future stopped feeling like a reaction. It became a direction. I chose relationships that felt reciprocal, work that felt honest, days that didn't require recovery afterward. I learned to recognize peace not as a reward but as a baseline. And when something disrupted that baseline, I addressed it quickly, without anger, without drama, without hesitation. That was power. Not loud, not aggressive, not performative, just consistent. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. It became manageable, predictable in a good way, flexible without being fragile. I trusted myself to handle what came next, not because I'd planned for everything, but because I'd survived without losing myself. That confidence didn't come from toughness. It came from knowing I wouldn't abandon myself again. And so the days kept unfolding, quietly, steadily, without needing a final scene. There was a moment, small enough that no one else would have noticed, when I realized I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I used to do that constantly, imagining what I'd say if I ran into someone from my past, preparing explanations no one had asked for, practicing calm responses to situations that hadn't happened yet. That noise disappeared. Not suddenly, naturally. One day I caught myself responding in real time without fear of saying the wrong thing. My words came from where I stood, not from where I'd been. And that felt like freedom. I stopped checking for emotional exits in rooms, stopped scanning faces for disapproval. I could stay present without monitoring the temperature of everyone else's comfort. That changed how people responded to me. They leaned in. They listened. They trusted what I said. Not because I demanded authority, but because I wasn't searching for approval. I learned something important then. Confidence isn't assertive behavior. It's the absence of self-doubt in motion. My days found a rhythm. Wake up early without an alarm. Drink coffee slowly. Do work that required focus instead of constant defense. I didn't multitask to avoid feeling. I let thoughts finish. That alone changed everything. Sometimes, a memory would surface unexpectedly. Not sharp. Not painful. Just present. I didn't push it away. I let it pass through like weather. It no longer asked for judgment or reaction. That's when I knew it had lost its power. I had spent years thinking closure was something you confront head-on. But closure turned out to be something you walk past without stopping. I didn't need to forgive in words. I didn't need to confront in person. I didn't need acknowledgement. I needed alignment. And I had it. I became someone who trusted timing. Not in a passive way, but in a grounded one. I stopped forcing outcomes. I let things reveal themselves fully before deciding where I stood. That patience made my decision sharper. I noticed I was drawn to people who spoke plainly, who didn't perform kindness, who didn't confuse intensity with depth. I valued consistency over charm, presence over promises. Those values simplified my life. Even conflict changed shape. When disagreements came up, they didn't escalate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't retreat either. I stated my position calmly and waited. If there was space for resolution, it appeared. If not, I walked away without resentment. No drama. No aftermath. Just resolution. At night I slept deeply. The kind of sleep that doesn't require distraction to arrive. No racing thoughts. No old scenes replaying themselves. Just rest. That rest became the foundation for everything else. I wasn't building a life to prove resilience anymore. I was building one that felt sustainable. Somewhere along the way, I understood something that would have terrified me years earlier. I didn't need my story to make sense to anyone else. It made sense to me. That was enough. The world didn't change overnight, but my relationship to it did. I moved through it without bracing, without shrinking, without explaining. I belonged where I stood. And the story, quiet one, the unannounced one, the one without applause. I started noticing how little I needed to explain myself. That used to feel impossible. I once believed that if I didn't provide context, people would misunderstand me, and that misunderstanding would somehow erase me. But over time, I learned something steadier. The people who matter don't require translation. They observe. They adjust. They stay. I stopped narrating my life out loud. Stopped turning choices into announcements. When something worked out, I let it work out privately. When something didn't, I handled it without turning it into a story. That restraint became a kind of discipline. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing not to perform. There's power in letting outcomes speak for themselves. I noticed that my reactions had slowed, not because I was detached, but because I was no longer reactive. I gave myself space between stimulus and response. That space made me precise. Precision replaced emotion, not coldness. Clarity. I could tell when something was worth my energy and when it wasn't. I no longer confused urgency with importance. Some things simply didn't deserve a response. That felt like maturity. I invested in routines that grounded me. Small things, consistent things, the kind that build trust with yourself. Morning light, movement, writing without an audience, silence without discomfort. These habits didn't make life exciting. They made it solid. Occasionally, someone would remark on how put together I seemed. I'd smile, knowing they were seeing the result, not the process. They hadn't witnessed the internal negotiations, the boundaries practiced in private, the decisions made without witnesses. That was fine. I wasn't collecting recognition. I was collecting peace. I realized that the past hadn't disappeared. It had simply stopped demanding attention. It no longer interrupted my focus or dictated my reactions. It had been filed away, not forgotten, but no longer active. Like a closed chapter that doesn't reopen itself. I became better at endings, too. Conversations ended cleanly. Relationships ended respectfully. Phases of life ended without resentment. I didn't cling to things past their expiration date. Letting go stopped feeling like loss. Felt like accuracy. I trusted myself to know when something was complete. And when it was, I moved on without dragging pieces of it forward. That trust was earned. I didn't chase intensity anymore. I valued steadiness. I valued people who showed up the same way twice. I valued environments that didn't require me to stay alert. Safety became attractive, not boring, sustainable. I could plan ahead without anxiety. I could enjoy the present without scanning for threats. I could imagine the future without needing to escape the now. That balance was something I once thought I'd never have. And still, nothing dramatic happened. No grand reunion. No overdue apology. No cinematic confrontation. Just a life that felt increasingly like my own. And that quiet ownership, that unshakable sense of authorship, kept deepening. The story didn't rush. Didn't need to. It knew where it was going. At some point, I stopped waiting for a moment that would officially declare everything over. Because I realized something important. Life doesn't announce endings. It reveals them quietly. One evening I was sitting alone doing nothing remarkable. No music. No phone. Just the soft hum of the room around me. And it occurred to me that I wasn't replaying anything. Not conversations. Not regrets. Not alternate outcomes. The silence wasn't heavy. It was complete. That's when I understood. The story had already shifted into its final phase without asking for permission. The people who once defined my pain were no longer characters in my daily thoughts. They existed as facts, not forces. Memories without momentum. Names without gravity. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. And that felt better. I had spent so much of my life believing closure required confrontation. Words spoken. Truth revealed. justice witnessed. But closure turned out to be far less dramatic. Closure was waking up without dread. Closure was choosing without fear. Closure was trusting myself without needing reassurance. I didn't need acknowledgement from anyone who failed me. I had already acknowledged myself. The future didn't look perfect. It looked honest, manageable, open. A space where I could move forward without carrying proof of survival in my hands. I had survived. But more importantly, I had arrived. There was nothing left to prove. Nothing left to expose. Nothing left to reclaim. I wasn't building a life to recover anymore. I was living one to experience. And so the story ended the way most real stories do. Not with revenge. Not with applause. Not with a final word. But with peace that didn't ask to be explained. And that was enough.